Hello and welcome back to Crew Parley. Normally on this channel, I respond on the spot to the prompts you folks submit, Parley, and Crew Parley is the reverse. I submit a prompt and then you all respond, and I respond to the responses. This one is about getting worse later. So as opposed to people saying that something gets better later, something I feel I've mostly finished assassinating in Parley's series, I don't really accept that as a good or usually even real argument for most pieces of media, but I absolutely do think that it's a common phenomenon that media gets worse later in some meaningful way. The prompt I wrote was, on a basic level, entertainment driven by its premise is going to get old as it unfolds. And indeed, I'm confident that most of you will be able to think of plenty of media you figured you'd enjoy and which started strong, but then which fell apart as things progressed. Tell me your biggest disappointments in media, in any type of media. I'd also be keen to hear if you diagnose the issue differently. Obviously, not every disappointing piece of art you experience will be disappointing because of its premise or it getting worse later. So what else drives this phenomenon in your experience? Does all media simply have some sort of cap on how long it can go on without getting questionable? Or is there a reasonable way to let a single continuous item of entertainment continue on indefinitely? And I elaborated that this prompt is trying to combine a relatively easy condition, share literally any media that disappointed you as it went on, with a light focus on its premise and how that turned out, with a more complex one. Philosophically, how does all that work to you? And so you will see in this parlay that there's going to be a lot of people just saying they hate a piece of media, and it is related, it's mild to moderately related to this prompt, and that's fine. I invited that. That's why I always read my prompt at the beginning, but that's why I'm specifying that here. They're not doing anything wrong by saying that. I invited that, and part of the point of this is to explore why does this happen. As I said in the prompt, I feel like I kind of already know, which is sort of why I asked this. Do other people think it's the same? When other people describe the phenomenon I think is happening, do they describe it the same way I would? Or when I say, oh, its premise wears out, do you think the same thing I mean by that? I find it's a very good way to learn more about your views, to say them and just hear how other people would say the same point, because it often isn't the same point, and reveals things about that perspective that you, or I in this case, just didn't know, even though it is kind of the same thing as the thing I felt like I already knew. So this is going to be a crew parlay of anger and savagery and destruction and hatred for some pieces of media that I hope you will understand is not meant to be an attack on you liking those pieces of media, but these people are going to explain why they certainly didn't like them or had problems with parts of them. We'll certainly talk about that. Saying a piece of media is bad doesn't mean you're bad for liking it is certainly going to come up later in this parlay, maybe obviously. This is also therefore going to be a more profane parlay. That's fine. We do that here at times. I'm mostly just going to read through them the way you all wrote them. But just know that most of the profanity isn't mine, for whatever that's worth. That being said, primarily, I think this is a tour of the ways that things get bad later. I actually think that worked very well. Often, one of the strengths of Crew Parlay as it emerges is that we get to see many different people's way of thinking of the general concept. And I was pleased to see that a lot of you had different interpretations or ways of looking at why did this get bad later, through what mechanism. And there's actually a rather large number of those mechanisms. Actually, finally, before we start, sorry, I know this intro is a little on the long side. This is also the longest crew parlay ever in terms of prompt responses. I don't actually know about the runtime. It might be surprisingly modest. I guess you can see, so you tell me, right? So at the end of this crew parlay, I am going to talk a little bit about the future of crew parlay, where we're going and how we can kind of make it work, because I do think I need to direct that more, and a lot of it is my fault. So it's fine. And by the way, it's not going anywhere when people say the future of whatever. It's totally fine, but it's just time to refine that a little bit. So I think that's exciting, actually, but I'll leave it till the end. Okay, let's begin. Starting with eye patch notes. spoilers slash incorrect synopsis for Torum Online, but iPatch Notes cannot recommend it in good faith regardless. Unless the proration system that they've talked about in their series of Parley sounds really, really interesting, but they digress. The overall plot of Torum Online is parasitic invaders from realms colliding, with gods missing from their thrones and other fun fantasy tropes. The first major and recurring antagonist is Empress Venena. Venena? I'm going to say Venena. Conceding her country for personal gain, the player suppresses the parasitized Empress only for her to flee and fight another day. And when that day arrives, the Empress is truly felled by the player. Except when the Empress was parasitized and killed, she was actually ejected to the other realm as an amnesiac, as one is wont to be. It turns out that this is the fate of many such parasite survivors, and they made a nice refugee camp for themselves, of course, you know. Mind Torum Online is an MMORPG that has its story told over months and years, so defeating the Empress and finding her oblivious but happy in another world is a revelation for the player as much as the character. You may be wondering why this story beat is appearing in a crew parlay about disappointments. Well, this reunion with the Empress after real-world years for some players has her die like 2 cutscenes later. Why, I just came to terms with her reappearing in the story, and even the characters debate whether amnesia is grounds for forgiveness. She barely has any dialogue in this short stint, and that is why Torum Online is sort of peak kusoge material. Kusoge is a portmanteau of kuso, shit, and ge, like game, in Japanese, and it means a shit game. It is often used like sort of affectionately, you know, as it's like a not so bad it's good, but I'm here for the meme kind of thing is the cultural context, a little bit of kusoge. I would agree that from what you've told me about Torum Online over these parlay, it is indeed peak kusoge material. Glorious. See also some poor localization choices. One of the lines reads, "You've been a parent and daughter for 10 or more years, haven't you? You've been a parent and daughter for 10 or more years, haven't you?" Why is this an or why is this a question? Another line says, "How could you call your daughter Flop?" Question mark, exclamation point. How could you call your daughter Flop? A flop? A failure? Is flop really the word you wanted to use here? Note also that a few cutscenes later, the localization uses the term bibliobuli. Besides the Latin speakers in the audience, is anyone going to know what that means? To save you some time, bibliobuli comes from the Latin, book, biblio, and then buli, the other root is to drink, and so it means like someone who drinks down literature. It's like calling someone a voracious reader, you know, voracious meaning like to eat hungrily. I guess Latin thinks that you drink literature. Okay, it's interesting. Again, not a term that and another thing is that bibliobuli doesn't really sound like a lot of the other words in modern English that use the biblio root. People will think book, I guess, but I don't know, like lots of other examples. Bibliography, for example. Yes, it has to do with a book, of course, but like it's not really very connected to how that word is used. No one is going to intuit what that means. It doesn't sound like what it means in a lot of modern English. Anyway, that to save you some time, that's what it means. Sure, so this is a good one to start with. It's an example of a lot of things that we're going to talk about later. It's an example of a game that if it goes on for long enough, there's going to be a lot of memes, just ridiculousness from, janky translation or whatever. Obviously, if a piece of media goes on long enough, there is, on the maybe most basic level we're going to talk about today, more time for mistakes, of course. You simply will do more things wrong if the work goes on longer. And I think a critical concept for when a work just has errors in it is to keep in mind that most people have a threshold for that type of thing. If there's one or two things wrong, one or two glitches, over the course of, let's say, like a 10-hour game, for a lot of people, that will feel like par for the course. The game doesn't go perfectly, but like whatever. But then if the game goes on maybe 30 hours, and there's, to be fair, the same percentage of glitches per unit of time, but the game has been longer, and therefore the numerical number of instances of glitch is higher, but like it's still only 3 or 4 in 30 hours. Again, the percentage of time that you were experiencing a glitch while playing the game has stayed the same, but just the number of events when you remember that game where there was a glitch has increased. I feel there's a clear phenomenon that most people get more annoyed by that. And whether you think that's a good instinct or not, I feel is sort of beside the point. Making something go on longer is bad for a lot of reasons. A lot of reasons. And this is one of them, which is that people will just be less charitable at a certain point, or their patience will wear thin. So, yeah, I do think that I like that you gave the examples of just like, level translation, because as we'll go, and somebody else commented, it's not that bad. They're not that bad. How could you call your daughter flop is kind of glorious, actually. The next line is, what kind of father are you? How could you not use articles in your sentences, you fiend? Which is delightful, of course. That being said, it is interesting that this comes in a story, again, that is an MMO. So as you mentioned, there's this pacing problem. That's another one. If a piece of media goes on for a long time, it will often get worse later in that there's just continuity issues. On a more basic level, actually, to be charitable to something like Torum Online for a minute, you as a person are just not in the same place in your life. So, for example, a lot of people have this phenomenon where they remember an old game or show fondly, and they don't notice that part of why is because it was a time in their life that they overall enjoyed more. For example, people remembering, I don't know, like old World of Warcraft, which I played when it first came out. And let me tell you, was a hot mess jank fest. I mean, I was there for it, but it is totally disingenuous to argue that it was like such a glorious and amazing game before, and that now it's just worse. It's different in ways you might like less. That's fine. But I mean, like, folks, World of Warcraft didn't launch with an in-game clock, okay? Like, that's not, these are not the same thing. Putting that argument aside, the point I'm trying to make is that a lot of people, when they remember that fondly, are actually significantly attaching their psychological memories of, like, they liked being younger and having more free time more, not necessarily just the game. The reason I bring this up is because if something goes on for long enough, you can't experience all of it within the same beat in your life, the same chapter of your existence. And this has an effect on the media. And so pretty much no matter what the thing is, even if, as I had gregariously proclaimed in the prompt, you could find a way for a single continuous item of entertainment to continue on indefinitely, it would still be bad for most people because they simply wouldn't be able to experience it all with the same, like, moment in their lives. Hell, on the first place, most people simply wouldn't be able to experience it. A really good example of this for me would be Critical Role, one of the longest stories and probably pieces of video media ever created. Seasons of Critical Role, if you can even call them seasons, I feel like they're so long that seems ridiculous, are often 4-hour episodes most weeks. So one a week, 4 hours, not every week, but most weeks for years. That is a tremendously massive story to be told. And if you're not familiar, Critical Role is like an actual play of people playing D&D with a pretty heavy narrative focus. They are linear stories. That's, I guess, overall anyway. There is some slice of lifey stuff in there. I would argue Critical Role is mostly a linear story. And I guess we'll have to see with Campaign 4 right now. But anyway, I don't closely follow Critical Role. It's just something I've studied and known of and followed for a time. I've watched maybe a couple dozen episodes of Critical Role, which is a lot, but not compared to how much there is. Anyway, it's still one of the longest stories I've ever listened to, so go figure. And I thought a lot of it was good, but of course the point is that just isn't going to occur in the same state of mind. If you have a perspective that currently means you will enjoy Critical Role, it's pretty hard to continue having that perspective for long enough for Critical Role to end. You see what I mean? So on a basic level, there is a drawback to truly enormous pieces of media. Now, I'm not sure how much this is going to come up later, In my notes, it didn't come up a lot, but it seems logical to me now. So just to introduce it as a concept. I do think that people have this different view of length in media from me. It's really common that people have this negative reaction when they hear that like a book or like a show they want to watch is long. Obviously, on a basic level, something being moderately long is good, because if you like it, there's a lot of it. And I don't really understand at the surface level why people think that a book being long means, oh no, that's really long. That would be a big commitment. No, it wouldn't. You can start it, and then if you don't like it, it doesn't matter how long it is, you can just drop it. And if you do like it, now it's less of a commitment mentally, because you don't need to find a new piece of entertainment to enjoy for longer than for most media. This is good. I think that going a level below, the reason people think that that's bad is because they're thinking they need to get to the end of it. But if that's why you want to read the piece of media, I don't agree that that is good. Yet another dimension of longer things being bad or inevitably getting worse later is that, you know, if you are waiting for the ending, well, it doesn't come as soon. But I personally would challenge that idea. I'm not sure how much this will come up later. I won't force it if it doesn't. But I would suggest throw my hat into the ring for that being a reason people commonly cite that long things are bad, that I really don't agree. I think that that is a misguided approach to trying to enjoy these texts. For me, the archetypical example, sorry, core audience, maybe you're sick of hearing this example, but it's a useful one, is Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive, which has the hilarious Journey Before Destination as a motto. As a book series that I'm sure they're very long, he was commonly told, oh, but it's like too long or something. That doesn't really make sense as a criticism, in my opinion. But a lot of people think it, so I thought I would address it. I don't think that actually makes that much sense. And if you feel strongly about that, I'm not denying your experience. I want to gently suggest that it's worth investigating. I mean, why? There are a lot of advantages to it being moderately long. What exactly is the problem with it being like a medium length? And again, obviously I bring this up around Critical Role because also most, long pieces of media are not that long and actually don't have many of these problems of a work going forever. The Stormlight Archive has a concrete ending, well, for its first half anyway, for now. Hopefully Sanderson will finish it before he dies. In a Q&A, he was asked, how long will it take you before you finished all the Cosmere books? And he said, 72. And everyone went, why is that such a specific number? Anyway, you've done the math. You've done the math. Okay, that's slightly disconcerting, but okay. So yeah, I don't know. A good starting point. Certainly MMOs are going to be part of a big trend in this parlay, which is like media that never has a set ending point. If it's a book or something like Critical Role, obviously on a basic level, it might be very, very, very long, but the premise is that there will be an ending. Whereas a lot of MMOs, or I think gaming in general, is most guilty of being a story art form at times, not always, but a lot of the time, that is made initially without a plan for it, like what the ending will be, or there being an ending at all, potentially, right? A lot of these games just kind of end service, and there's not a clear... many a time they'll make an effort to create some sort of ending. Final Fantasy XIV's noteworthy case where they kind of rebooted the whole game and they actually added in an in-world apocalypse, like for the old version of the game when the server shut down. So there was an event if you played the significantly worse, janky original version of the game where the in-game world ends and then like the servers are gone and that version of the game is gone, and then it's called Final Fantasy: A Realm Reborn, which it I guess exists again. I don't know Final Fantasy people if that's in the lore, but I mean that's cool. I bring it up because very few pieces of media do this. Anyway, moving right along. So yeah, it's interesting that these are cases where, of course, games just kind of get bad. Things get bad if they go on for a long time, like Parlay. So let's continue. Ragnavar says, there's a lot to be said about how bad even the first arc of SAO Sword Art Online is. But if there's ever a more perfect example of a truly bad, why didn't they stop sooner experience, then that second arc really does take the cake. It's not even the last time Reki Kawahara, the author, will use imminent sexual assault as a plot device either. Not sure if that makes the first one better on average or worse, largely because I refuse to give it the mental energy to consider. It's tasteless when SAO uses it just for Kirito to come in and save the day, with no reflection or resulting impact on the characters that almost got assaulted. And this isn't to dismiss all the other ways that SAO sucks either, just the one that sticks out as the straw that should break more metaphorical camelbacks than it does, given how many have seen SAO. Sure, so basically what you're getting at here is, because the show pulls this tactic a lot, if we give Reki Kawahara the benefit of the doubt, and I mean, why, but okay, for the sake of criticism, let's just do it. You could say, well, he literally just can't think of a way for his protagonist to save the day other than his romantic interest being assaulted. That's sort of pathetic and immature and not handled with gravity. You know, you could cover that as a subject with appropriate gravitas, but he does not. I think anyone who watches that will agree. But he does it twice. In fact, I would argue he does it a lot more than twice. Having had the misfortune, it's a story for another time. Believe me, I suffered just as much as you think I would have, because I have seen all of what exists of SAO. He does not do it only 2 times. This is a problem that this person has. I don't know why he can't think of other ways, but that is the only one he seems to be able to think of. So sure, this is an interesting example where the author basically proves that it's not just a whiff or a one-off. You know, they just for some reason thought that was a good plot device at that one time, insensitively handled, but maybe they tried to and failed or something. But then as it goes on, it becomes clear that no, he just is being bad about that for some reason. He thinks that isn't a problematic, but it just very clearly is for a lot of reasons. It's not handled carefully. The scenes are very disturbingly sexualized. That's extremely insensitive. I don't really understand that. There's ways to do this. I've seen examples of it done, maybe not well, I'm not sure I would say that, but certainly attempts to be sensitive about the subject. This is not that. And if you think that it is, then you ought to go check out those. It's not. So sure, it does like show that he is going to keep doing that, I guess. Here we're going to introduce another really interesting ongoing theme in this parlay, which is, now that we thankfully get to stop talking about that frustrating topic in Sword Art Online, which is the show was bad the whole time, but it wasn't clear that it was going to keep being that way. It's almost like rather than getting worse later, it becomes clear that it won't get better later, which is almost the same thing, but kind of not, you know? It's interesting because I would argue that Sword Art Online's first episode is actually not too bad. In fact, a lot of scathing criticisms of SAO over the years have landed on that. For people unfamiliar, which, congratulations, by the way, please don't watch it. It's a complete waste of your time. There's way better stuff out there. I could give you a list hundreds of shows long of things that you'll enjoy more. It is unnecessary. But the first episode is a very excited teenager getting a virtual reality device. The first one on the market, the Nerve Gear. It's like a helmet. It looks a little clunky. It looks like a first virtual reality device. He puts it on, sits in bed, boots up the first game, Sword Art Online, and enters it. He interacts with some players, they talk about and learn the ropes of the system. It becomes clear that he was a beta tester of the game, which is going to become a recurring, extremely stupid plot point later, because it doesn't really make sense. Anyway, no. And then when his friend that he meets in-game, an acquaintance he starts up conversation with, tries to log out to get his delivery pizza, he finds that the log out button is gone. And it is revealed at the climax of the episode that they are trapped in the game. The Nerve Gear has a disabled failsafe that can fry their brains with microwaves and kill them in real life. If they die in the game, they die in real life. And then Kirito, having the foresight of having been a beta tester, like immediately runs off to farm XP, basically. This show then devolves into utter banality. But to be fair, which again, why should we? But Reki Kawahara has explained that he wrote this for a writing contest at the last minute, and I will go on later to be attacking publishers for not slapping the thing out of his damn hand. Anyway, look forward to that, right? So that, there you go. You don't have to watch it. As Ragnavar continues, somehow still not the worst VR MMORPG depicted in media, but that's largely due to how bad the competition is. At least SAO pretends that it wasn't built for one person and that person alone, but even then, SAO also does this by having dual wielding be an ability exclusive to the protagonist, even if it only really matters in the first arc, and otherwise it does put in at least some effort in pretending that there's a game people would actually play in there somewhere. Some effort, sure, yes. And that all happens at the beginning of the show. That's true. There's plenty still bad about it, but I get what the game's appeal supposedly is. There's also the GGO, Gun Gale Online. Gun Gale Online? Anyway, where Kirito is the Okay, where Kirito is the only person capable of using the lightsabers thanks to his same faster brain crap that was used to justify giving him exclusive access to dual wielding, but that's after the second arc of the show and thus doesn't exist, and you can't convince me otherwise. The spin-off is in the better non-Kirito as protagonist timeline after all, and thus doesn't count. I might have a more interesting, less milquetoast, pedestrian, well-known example, but it's the example that immediately came to mind upon recording the prompt, especially given how often we meme on SAO during streams. Yeah, I mean, Sword Art Online is a useful example in many ways, because it's so simple you don't have to watch it to understand it as an example. It's pretty bad in a lot of obvious ways. It's pretty bad in some less obvious ways. It's been parodied a lot of times, and it's very tropey. So a lot of the stuff it's doing is very, oh yeah, like you've seen that in some other media before. Again, like you don't need to watch this to use this as an example, really. It's interesting because a phenomenon of bad writing, in my opinion, and in my experience, as in high school and college, I spent a lot of time, for various reasons, but it is also my degree, editing other people's writing. A phenomenon of bad writing that is interesting for this subject is that often it will get worse later, and then get better later, and then get worse later, because a lot of things in the story are just ill-considered. It turns out that it's not that hard to sometimes write something that is a cool idea in a story, or sometimes excite the audience if they've bought into the basic premise. What's difficult is to do it consistently and systematically, and I would argue that the better works in the world are not necessarily always higher highs, but more consistent highs. And so, for example, a lot of people would argue that the, I don't know, fourth or fifth, who cares, arc of Sword Art Online, Alicization for people in the know, but I pity you if you are, it gets good, you know, for a little bit. I don't know, it's more like it's just a reboot that makes the argument that it is in the same continuity, you know what I mean? It's sort of just like a restart of the show. Kirito loses his memories, so already that's a fantastic start. And then while Asuna is a less annoying character, a more better, but still not that good character, she isn't in this part, and so the author doesn't have, but still somehow finds a way to cram Assault as a plotline. That's true. There's the fourth or fifth instance of Assault as a plotline in that arc. So it's not then suddenly good. It's not. But I would argue that the premise and structure of the writing, if I'm forced at gunpoint to be critical as a literary critic, is better in that part. But I'm not sure that he gets better as a writer. You know what I mean? It's basically all the same stuff. It's just that if you have enough ideas and need to continue a story for long enough, just like you will inevitably just make more mistakes, you're also eventually going to get something right. You know, they say a broken clock is right twice a day, that kind of thing, you know? You also have the phenomenon of if you throw a bunch of darts at the wall and see what sticks, some of them will be surprisingly good hits near the bullseye, if you take them in isolation. But obviously if you see that the person had a big sawed-off shotgun full of darts, then you'd know, oh yeah, there's no skill involved in hitting in that spot. I think this is about the time that we need to introduce some theory of enjoyment discussion. I talk about this a lot in other Parley because it comes up a lot in Parley. This idea and a helpful way I like to think of media criticism, that there's the piece of media itself and what it reliably creates as an experience, and then there is what you as an audience member bring to the experience to kind of meet up with it. And almost all enjoyable media is a symbiosis of these two things. But when critiquing a piece of media, it's necessary to be willing to separate what the piece of media would reliably do by itself and what you can have as an experience. It's a valid experience to have, but which does require you to bring extra materials. If you enjoyed this, but it doesn't reliably create that experience for the audience, that's good. It's not wrong that you enjoyed it. It's valid your experience was real, but it's your experience. It's a good thing about you as an audience member. That's a thing. You can be a good audience member. Not necessarily a good thing about the piece of media. Just because you like something doesn't mean we need to attribute that positivity to the piece of media. It can just be you. If I get drunk with a bunch of friends and watch Sharknado is not good. Me and my friends are fun. I would argue. That was actually one of my first dates. Fantastic, by the way. Highly recommended. I had met this guy and he was like, hey, I got a bottle of wine and we could watch Sharknado. And I went, hell yeah, brother. Let's go. We met in like Tycho Club or something. And it was a lot of fun. That was fantastic. But Sharknado is not good, nor do I really remember much of it, to be blunt. I mean, and why would you? And it was delightful, you know, a good movie in some way to have that experience with. But to say it's a good movie to get drunk to, obviously the beer needs some credit, the wine needs some credit, the cocktails should be attributed some of the responsibility. Yeah? If you went to a wine and dine, you wouldn't give the food or the drink or the pretty seat all of the credit. You know, it's the whole experience. And you also get some of the credit. People get anxious because they feel like if you say a thing they like is bad, you're saying they are bad. But that is too immature to be part of this discussion anymore. So I've addressed it as much as I will. We're not saying that, and I don't have any further patience for the subject. I think that the interesting thing to see here is that a piece of media will often be inconsistent if it isn't that good. Another thing I think is worth considering is that SAO kind of has a perspective fixing thing. If the middle part is so bad and then it gets like a little better, I mean, like water in a desert, give me some immediately. You see what I mean? Nobody would ever not want Kirito to get amnesia after what you have watched if for some reason you watch up to the arc where he gets amnesia. So of course you're gonna like that part. I don't know. When I watched it, I candidly got excited about that. I went, he woke up as with clearly an amnesiac in a fantasy world, and I went, he forgot that if you die in the game, you die in real life. Now he might actually die. Anyway, but that's not, anyway, it's complicated. So enough about that. But a good example, I would argue. Mr. Fruit, moving on to some examples of media that True Parley Grandmaster Fruit says, I rarely get angry at media, but when I do, I become livid. I told you there was going to be a lot of anger in this parlay. It's kind of nice, right? You get it out a little bit. I've rated each and every game that I've played, which ends up being around 400 on my scale from 0 to 5. There are only 5 games that made me angry enough to break the scale. 5 games that forced me to assign the dreaded rating of -1. Oh, you figuratively broke the scale. -1. Not literally out of anger, crushing the scale. Okay. I was imagining like breaking a weighing scale. Figuratively breaking the scale by assigning them -1. I do this as well, actually, in my ranking system. I have a ranking that is for build systems. I rank a build system F if it is not just bad, but is kind of like a false build system. There aren't actually real choices, despite my and other players' best efforts to create different choices. But the build system has the facade of having choices. It looks like and makes the player expect that it would have offer choices, but it doesn't actually in some way offer choices. It's very poorly balanced, or you know, you can't actually complete some of the content without picking a specific thing, but the game doesn't say that, etc. You know, one of these -1s, Mr. Fruit continues, is a tasteless parody cash grab that was gifted to me. Another is a comedy adventure game that repeats the same joke for 3 hours, so the bar is pretty high. The third is a fighting game that feels so bafflingly horrible to control that I refuse to accept that it went through QA. And that leaves us with the final 2, which actually fit our topic. 2 games which I desperately wanted to like, but that got worse and worse as they went on. Those 2 games are Fire Emblem Fates and Starfield. I could go and give you a 10-page explanation where I crash out about why these games make me angry beyond all reason for both of those games. I will contain my rage and give you the abstract instead. It's actually still pretty long. But personally, I'm here for it. I was about to make a joke about, oh yeah, give me that version. But scrolling down, you kind of did, which I think is good. That's what we're here for, man. Both games are sequels in a way. Fire Emblem Fates follows up Fire Emblem Awakening, the beloved game which revived the Fire Emblem franchise from the brink of death. Starfield is the newest Bethesda game. It's not a sequel per se, but it is the newest in the line of game design tradition. You could arguably trace back to the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, including the engine it uses. Grr, yeah, that's questionable. Both Fire Emblem Fates and Starfield present themselves as being the radical new interpretation of their respective game design tradition. Fire Emblem Fates ditches the old, mostly linear story structure for a narrative with 3 branches, 3 different campaigns in one game, depending on how you choose in an early chapter. Starfield takes on a new setting in a near-future sci-fi, or as the devs call it, NASA punk. NASA punk is in quotes. B for effort. Keep working on it. Developers. It ditches traditional game maps for a galaxy full of planets to explore. Just for the record, I believe that none of these approaches or radical new directions are fundamentally flawed, just that the games fail to deliver on these promises. These instances of those ideas are bad, not the ideas themselves. Cool. The problem with Fire Emblem Fates, 3 branches, is the following. You choose between the defending party or the aggressor in a war, your bloodline versus the family you grew up with, already bad. The third choice is to reject both and blaze your own path through destiny. The narrative is almost treated as a puzzle, where both of the normal campaigns are incomplete. They set up mysteries that are never resolved. The idea is that you then play the third campaign to learn the answers to those mysteries. I suffer, we'll get back to that, through the first 2 campaigns, which are 20 to 50 hour games by the way, and arrive at the beginning of the third, which you're supposed to play last. In the first mission of the third campaign, one of the characters, Azura, proceeds to lore dump dialogue for 5 minutes in a cave, answering each and every mystery with, "It was caused by this evil guy from the parallel dimension," while setting you up to replay variants of missions from the first 2 campaigns. Fuck this game. I did not play 80 hours to get a lore dump, which is supposed to compensate for your incompetent storytelling. And here we've arrived at the kind of thing I think I was imagining more at first. It's been delightful to see this variety, as it often is in Crew Parlay, but I think in my mind this was the elemental example. This is a case where it probably was bad from the beginning, but for a lot of players, again, if you're focused on that conclusion, that's one reason why. A lot of people might say that, oh, it gets good later, or like the ending is good or something, because they want to know the answer, and then there is an answer, and that process is like novel. You know, you play a few paths and then one of them like solves it. There are actually a lot of games like that, but anyway, I don't know. There might not have been at the time, by the way, so go figure. But I don't think that that means it is good. It's just I haven't seen this before. I believe it is a great talent to be able to experience a piece of media and detect when it's not so much that it's doing the thing it's doing very well, it's just that you have not seen that thing done ever before, and it's not necessarily doing like that good of a job or as good of a job as you could with it. But this doesn't happen in mainstream media criticism, and things will often be praised merely for being innovative. That's not good unless it's actually helpful or fun. Inventing something that is useless is not yet good. It can be helpful in the scientific community if it leads to a future discovery. Okay, but I don't really accept that simply discovering that this is a bad way to make this type of game in a new way is good. Furthermore, another way to look at it is that, of course, as Mr. Fruit says, this doesn't then make the preceding mysteries good. Having these unexplained tensions and no indication, I don't know if there's any indication, but let's just imagine there's no indication that they will be resolved, is bad. It's bad now. In the future, there being an explanation does not make it good now. It might make it feel good to you in the future, good for you for being patient, but it is bad for the part of the story where it's unexplained. Nothing excuses that from wasting your time. And as has been often said, mine. Not that this was a waste of time. I'm delighted to get to skip this experience. So yeah, I think that this is a great example of the kind of thing where You can understand why it didn't seem bad at the beginning, but you could argue if you looked back, it kind of was bad at the beginning. It's just that it is a legitimate narrative tactic to lead up to some reveal, and it's not always clear when that's being done disingenuously. I think you could do, and we should do, a whole parlay just about how do you do that? I feel like this is a huge problem of narrative design. How do you make it so a Chekhov's gun or a potential narrative payoff on the wall of the story isn't just cheap and basically forces the audience to kind of put up with the story until it pays off? Now, to be harsh, one approach is, well, don't tolerate them at all. The story gets no excuse for something it has not yet done. I enjoy the story if I enjoy it now, right now. Not in 3 chapters, not I hope it will get good later, but I'm enjoying it now. I'm not just trapped and need to know what happens next, and you can look up the answer on the internet in the modern age, so that kind of universally saves you from this in a way. But instead, I'm enjoying it now. I've read plenty of stories that have amazing twists set up very early that I had no way to know would be an amazing twist, but the nuts and bolts of the story the whole time through was still interesting. It isn't an excuse to then have some payoff later. It's a very common hack writing tactic to make a story that builds up and sets up a lot of mysteries, but doesn't actually do anything interesting or fun. The characters aren't interesting. The plot developments aren't interesting in and of themselves. The story just promises that there will be some interesting thing like later. And no, it's not even that hard or at all unheard of to just make that part of the story also be interesting. And there are plenty of common examples of stories that do that well. So yeah, to me, this is in many ways the archetypical example where if you look back, you might argue it was always bad. I don't necessarily think, and I think we will come back to later, if I recall, the show notes for this one are very long, so forgive me. I've been referencing them a lot more than usual. To the topic of if the story has a janky ending or like gets much worse later, then does that then undo some good that the story had in the first place? And yeah, I mean, as the same side of the coin as this subject, I mean, not necessarily. The problem is just that sometimes that casts your memory of the things you already experienced in a different light and can undo some of the enjoyment of them kind of sitting with you. But in a way, I would say no. Many games, I think it is reasonable to evaluate them fairly at the beginning for being like good for what they were. And then they just went on too long, but that doesn't necessarily make the beginning part bad. It's kind of more complicated than that, but leave it there for now. Mr. Fu continues, Bethesda games had a gameplay loop that was built around exploration. You would go out into the world intending to do one thing, only to get sidetracked by another thing, and then another, forgetting why you came there in the first place. Most of the content was mediocre, but that didn't matter because they nailed the exploration, in the sense that you knew there was something interesting and unique in any unexplored corner of the map you would visit. I do think that matters and do not like this gameplay style, but yes, I would agree that is why the people that like it like it. This exploration is what held those games together. Sure, for the people that enjoyed them, it would naturally create stories that gave context to your adventures. There's an organicness. Starfield, for reasons we won't get into because this is long enough as it is, features only procedurally generated maps. By their nature, these maps cannot result in interesting exploration. It takes some time for this realization to truly sink in, but all planets feel the same. There are no empty, unexplored planets on the interstellar frontier. Instead, they all have the same 20-odd copy-pasted structures, conveniently placed every 800 meters or so. Mr. Fruit says, so I did a small fact check, and it seems that the actual number is 6 types of locations with something between 25 to 44 structure variants total, many of them being technically different, but pulling from the same set of assets, like the dungeons in Elden Ring. It also feels worse than it is because the dungeons are placed randomly, like truly randomly, which gives you a decent chance to run into an exact replica because they didn't try to do anything to make sure they don't get placed near each other. This happened to me when I ran into an exact replica of a main story dungeon on a random planet. The anomalies you find and the alien flora and fauna is even the same between planets. Never have I experienced such a profound sense of meaninglessness from a game. Devs, how did you misunderstand the emotional core of your games this badly? So this is why I brought up that example before. You probably figured it out, of does that then mean the beginning is bad? Well, I would say mostly no. You know, a lot of critics have clocked that the beginning of Starfield can feel wondrous, but it's when you realize that there isn't going to be more that it becomes clear, you know, okay, maybe it's bad. Does that make the beginning part bad? Well, no, I don't think. Your enjoyment of the novelty of finding this planet and experiencing these structures was real, and they really were unique for that small period of time. Then you discovered that they are not unique. And two things happen here. The first one is it taints your memory of when they felt unique. That's important. There is some damage. There's damage of a kind being done to your memory of the beginning of the game. I hope you would agree. Because you now realize that you're feeling like this unique experience of wondrously exploring this planet will mean I'm going to have a lot of other wondrous experiences of exploring planets. And now you know that was not true and was kind of a trick a little bit. That maybe feels bad. And you also no longer have that form of enjoyment. Part of the contents of that enjoyment was that you were looking forward to getting all these things in the future, and you're now probably not, I would imagine. And then two, a separate thing, it's clear that the game just doesn't, like, in the future likely have much else new. You haven't proven there's nothing else original in the game, but your lack of wonder from before, because now you've seen this copy pasted thing, does damage your expectation going forward that there will be other novel things, even though there, I don't know, but probably are, right? There probably are some things you haven't seen before. You haven't seen every copy pasted structure, but it still kind of feels like when you see one, you're not going to get the sense of wonderment that you got before, because you know that the game is doing this thing, or at least suspect. And again, it's the internet age, so it's pretty easy to find out that Google, oh yeah, it is doing the same thing over and over again. Sure. Go figure. Yeah, so again, it's an example where there is a damage of a kind done to the beginning of the game. But I still think it's worth considering that if you were to just make the game very short, you could see this as being enjoyable. Now, the conflict in this case is that the part that was enjoyable about discovering those new things on that planet for the first time was the expectation that because the game is long, what if that happens again 50 more times? Wouldn't that be amazing? But then you see the copy paste thing and then you know it isn't going to happen again 50 more times. So unfortunately, the game being short would mean that these designs wouldn't wear out their welcome, or they just wouldn't need to copy paste them. But the entire appeal of the designs is that you think that there will be a lot of them, which necessitates the game being long enough that it does have to actually have all these unique things in order to, like, you know, etc., do the thing. Now, I don't know. I mean, obviously there is a conflict or a difference compared to the previous example. In the Fire Emblem Fates example you gave, it is possible that the writing was bad the whole time, and just it was understandable to see what the reveal would be, but then that was just also bad. You see what I mean? It may not have been that the writing was good and got bad, just that there were parts of the writing that it was unknown yet if the twist would be good. Let's just imagine, for the sake of argument, a theoretical story. I can think of a story like this, where the nuts and bolts are really good. It addresses my complaint that the beginning of the story needs to be doing something entertaining in and of itself. You cannot just rely on a reveal that will be revealed later. It's very possible, easy, I think ought to be expected, that this story be interesting now as well. It cannot mortgage that interest to later. And if you are willing to put up with that story, I do think you are part of the reason the story was bad. It would have been clear that the story wasn't going to be good later. But anyway, let's imagine that the nuts and bolts of the story were good at the beginning, but there's also a twist that's led up to, and because this part of the story is working pretty well, the twist is led up to effectively. Like, that all looks good. And we would all just imagine a theoretical story where we all agree miraculously that that part of the story is good, but then the twist shits the bed, you know, and it's really, really bad. I can think of a story like this, a couple. Does it then ruin the beginning part of the story? Well, you could argue that if you were to just end it before the twist, that a lot of it would still work pretty well. And it would just be, what's the next book? Or that was left open-ended, or whatever. You could try to restructure the story so that that part was okay. Therefore, I think it's noteworthy that in Fire Emblem Fates, if we were to assume that the writing was kind of whatever, the game wasn't that fun to begin with, and it relied on this premise and then it was bad, Starfield is then arguably a little bit different. The quality of the 3D models that are copy-pasted might be rather good. The flora and fauna that are copy-pasted might be rather good. The nuts and bolts of the moment you had at first were fine. It was it continuing, and the fact that it kind of needed to continue, that maybe wasn't as good. Perhaps. Again, I really don't know, having played neither of these games, but obviously Starfield was in reviews enough that I've seen, I don't know. It's a fine looking game if you only look at it for 3 minutes in a game review. But I understand well enough that that's not the full scope. You get it. So it is interesting to see an example like this where it's not really the raw quality, it's the organization of the elements. And indeed, I think raw quality is overrated as a thing that is important. I just mean that there is some interest for the player. The problem is that Starfield does it in a way that requires there to then be all this other stuff as you move forward. So Mr. Fruit says, by the way, both games also completely mess up the basics of writing, plot, characters, and world. Both are exercises in tedium and questionable game design decisions. I cannot get into the details. This is unacceptably long for a group parlay entry as it is. Just know that there's a mountain of insults to add to the already crippling main injury. There's a lot more to be said here for both games, but there is one more thing I need to mention. To quote the Starfield review by the great internet funny man Seth, I know why I'm so angry. I'm not angry at the game. It's not even that bad. I'm angry because I paid $100 for it. The king of the chess club has done it again. Each time I tell myself, no, not this time, but I already know Todd is going to tell me lies, tell me sweet little lies, and each time I listen. I haven't heard this quote before, but okay, cool. I second that, Mr. Fruit says. I felt lied and deceived too, and I have only myself to blame. I paid an unacceptable amount of money for Starfield. Fire Emblem Fates is the same. Here's a twist. One thing I haven't mentioned is that you don't really choose which campaign you want to play at the beginning of Fire Emblem Fates. You choose at the store before knowing anything about that choice. Your campaign is decided by the version of the game you buy. If you reconsider or want to experience the other paths, you have to pay for them. How much? 35 euros per campaign on top of the 50 euro, base game. Fuck this game. Actually, fuck both these games. My point is, Mr. Fruit concludes, I don't think most stuff truly gets worse later. Most things are bad from the start. Some are just good at hiding it. What makes these two the exception is that you will not realize the depth of awfulness and incompetence these games possess until they've baited you into spending ungodly amounts of money on them. I really wanted to like both of these games, but couldn't. My disappointment for both of them was from the realizing that there was nothing of value to be extracted here. No story reveal, no emergent narrative, nothing else worth mentioning. The emotional core of these games was their eagerness to waste my time and money. That's a huge line. Indeed. So I was going to bring this up myself, that it's interesting to consider how these are games where it's not really that the game itself gets worse later, perhaps. I was suggesting in some cases it's arguable that it was bad from the start. But I do want to suggest a developing opinion that the concept of the game actually was bad from the start, and that was potentially clear from the beginning. Please understand, I'm not trying to make you feel like an idiot or something for not foreseeing that, but I took a jab at Bethesda's design earlier, and the reason I did that is because it is why this is a possibility. That type of design allows this type of thing to happen. It is fundamentally possible when you rely on the game having this way of having interconnected, or sort of open-ended exploration and quest design, when you're going to create a story by just like, we'll see what the player runs into. It is fundamentally possible that the game is kind of using that to dupe you, or it's very unlikely the game will be able to maintain that model going forward. But it requires that it does maintain the model for a while. This is the point I was making about how in Starfield, you could argue if the game just ended after 2 hours, then it's good, right? If the 3D models are good and that first world creates a sense of wonder, but it only creates that sense of wonder if the game is really long, and therefore promises that in theory, if it was good, it would have a bunch of these different exploration things to find. But then it's revealed that it doesn't. You don't know that it will be revealed that it doesn't have all this variety until you play that part. But it is clear that that will need to be true before you play that part. Does that make sense as a premise? You might reject this and say, well, you're blaming me for like not assuming everything is terrible. I don't mean to. I'm just suggesting that I do think there is a problem with that idea in design before you play any of the game. There's already a concern where, are they really going to maintain that over many, many hours? I personally have never ever heard of a game that uses that storytelling technique that actually works. That I'm not saying I didn't like them. I avoid all of them like the plague, so I wouldn't know, to be fair. What I'm saying is it seems to me like everyone who says they like this kind of game only really has mostly bad things to say about them, or they have their own issues. We will get into another example of this later, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth. Maybe you don't feel that way. I'm just saying the sentiment that I get from a lot of people who seem attracted to this formula for a game don't seem to have a lot of examples of it ever really being good, and I have a lot of sympathy. It sounds awesome, but that doesn't make it awesome, and I don't think they really ever are all that awesome. I feel like it's just that it's so appealing, very reminiscent of Sword Art Online. The premise is very appealing to a lot of people, but that isn't a story that is appealing. That's not the same thing. And I personally feel that in many ways it actually is clear that that's going to be bad from the start. In the first place, it often takes a lot of momentum to convince people that a story using this model will be good. You yourself, Mr. Food, actually had to do a good amount of convincing, along with SkillUp's review and a few other people in my personal life, that Nier Automata would not just be bad if part of the pattern of the game is you sort of replay it after finishing the first go-round. To me, it's so likely that will be bad. It is so overwhelmingly likely that that is setting up this scenario that it took me a long time. In fact, for me, famously, I owned Nier Automata the longest of any game I have ever played before playing it. I did really like it, by the way. I think it is an example of that going well. Although it is a little peculiar how it goes well. A separate topic, but we made like a million parlay about that, so. But the reason I had that resistance is because of this phenomenon, for the most part. It just seemed to me that the promise of a game like that is baiting this issue, is provoking this issue. And I just don't think it makes sense to believe that that will be fun. It feels to me like that's saying, if I mortgage the fun, maybe it will pay off. But I can have fun now in about 50 other ways. So why, like, who cares? I don't know. Again, I'm not trying to be unsympathetic or callous. It's something a lot of people wanted to enjoy. And in a way, I admire your optimism about it. But I don't know. I just don't feel like there's any need to listen to Todd Howard, the director or something of Bethesda, stupid little marketing lies. Like there's no need. There's plenty of other games that create a cool sense of exploration or any other phenomenon that just don't rely on this phenomenon, that are kind of fun from the beginning to an extent. So go figure. I don't really see it. Now, I could point to some examples that have worked well for me or that take a different strategy. You know, Baldur's Gate 3 is an interesting one where even if you were to play only the beginning or like the beginning of Act 1 or all of Act 1, I personally think that's still a pretty solid game in many ways. And if you play D&D 5th edition or 2024, it might be worth taking a look at that even if you have no intention of playing the rest, even if it would go on to repeat itself a lot later. But it doesn't. In fact, quite famously, in Act 3, they double down and create an enormous amount of completely new stuff. A lot of people actually didn't like that. That's why I'm bringing this up. To be fair, I do think I'm coming down pretty hard on, and maybe we, but I'll blame myself, are coming down pretty hard on the idea that the game needs to be full of all this original stuff to be enjoyable. I mean, a lot of the time that would be overwhelming. A lot of people drop Baldur's Gate 3, quite famously. A ton of people, statistically, dropped Baldur's Gate 3 in Act 3 because they felt overwhelmed. It was a long game they were enjoying, and after the climax of Act 2, a proper climax, and I think that's cool, personally. I like a sort of false climax, if you will, or a midpoint climax. Take me out to dinner first. Anyway, you like a midpoint climax. And then the game gives you like even more stuff. Again, I'll go back to my point at the beginning. Why is that bad? Why does that feel bad to people? Is it because they want to have finished the game to avoid spoilers on social media that would be better left unused? Is it because they think of it as part of their personality to have finished it and they're not focused on the journey over the destination? One could speculate, but I do think it's worth noting that it being so much more than the rest of the game kind of isn't good in a way. The game has set you up to expect a kind of environment, and you don't need to blow the player away with like a million more things necessarily. I fear that games like Starfield, hearing the critique that we've discussed here, will learn the long lesson. Well, they will, I guess, by learning the wrong lesson, which is they're going to look at something like Baldur's Gate 3 and go, oh, we needed to backload the game to get a better reaction out of the player. No, you can't use these stupid marketing tactics to make the game magically good. You have to just make the game good. You can't trick people into the game being good. Oh, I mean, you can. That's why these games still come out. People still buy them. But to me, I don't know. I feel like such an asshole. I feel like I'm being a curmudgeon when I say, if everybody just didn't have any hope for games being good and only cared about whether games demonstrate that they are good, then this would not happen. And this stupid kind of game would just die off and we could get a good version of it, which is what I want to play. What I want is for Todd Howard to go out of business so that I can play a good version of this game design formula. So anyway, I don't know. A little bit of anger from me, if I may. I will say again, Mr. Fruit's incredibly hard line. The emotional core of these games was their eagerness to waste my time and money. Holy shit. That's badass. Just Rusty. Yet another direction, surprisingly. I don't know if I'm too late to jump in on this. No, you're not. You weren't. But I've had the smoke of a parlay coalescing into something solid about my current experience with Invincible and recently watching Wicked for Good, Part 2 of the Wicked movie. Season 1 of Invincible is probably the only what if Superman was bad story I've actually enjoyed. Most of the show's first season is built around knowing Omni-Man is a villain and an order of magnitude stronger than anyone else in the setting, but not knowing his motivations, making it unclear in any scene if the veneer of niceness is going to drop and he's going to snap into sudden violence. I'm still enjoying the show. At this point, I have enough attachment to the characters that I'm curious to see where they all go. But the tension baked into season 1 now has nowhere to go, now that there are clear heroes and villains, and the show has largely devolved into a villain of the week format. I forget which scene it was during the current season which is airing, but I had a distinct moment where I realized this show is no longer objectively good. I'm just watching it because I like the characters, and decided to make a meal, decide if I want to continue watching or not, and then came back to it as I felt I was happy watching something that is comfortable slop, but not really artistically meritorious anymore. Interesting. Yes, another category of gets bad later that I expected to see a lot of. This is the premise-focused story. I have another very simple metric for avoiding media that I think is pretty clearly going to be bad statistically often. And I'd like to just stop for a moment and say, I know I kind of popped off about like, why does everybody like gamble on these Bethesda games so much? But part of the reason is just that I feel like what people always say they want is a heuristic, a shortcut, a thought tool, a measuring stick that they can use to decide which media to take a chance on. But everybody seems to be attached to the bad ones. I don't know, or the ones where there won't be that many exceptions, where the idea itself baits the badness. And I feel this is another of them. Premise-based media is the worst type of reason to enjoy a piece of media. I'm not trying to belittle anyone or make anyone feel bad or stupid. I feel bad and stupid for investing in some such media. But it's because these things are done to get people's attention, for marketing. It's not done because that is a good way for a piece of media to work. And when people recommend something by saying it's about this society where things are like this. It's like, well, no, it would be about its plot or its characters or its setting or its atmosphere. That's what a show or a piece of media is about. It's not about its premise. Its premise is the inciting incident, the thing before the piece of media starts. You know, the thing that to start a story you need to destroy. That's what a premise is. The thing that you're guaranteed not to have as you go further into the piece of media. Not guaranteed, but, you know, more or less. Now, sometimes premise is intertwined with what the story will be about. Just a couple examples. You could imagine something like a magic system in a story, or the thrust of the story is we need to do this, and now we're going to keep doing this. The premise is sometimes the thing that breaks the stasis at the beginning of the setting, not just like what the setting was like before. For example, is the premise of The Lord of the Rings that the hobbits live in a peaceful world, in a fantasy world in the Shire, and there's an evil Lord Sauron who has to be destroyed by throwing a ring into a volcano? Or do you describe the premise of The Lord of the Rings as Frodo needs to take the ring on a journey through, you know, Middle Earth to destroy the ring by throwing it into the volcano to destroy Sauron? If you describe it the second way, that is what the story will go on to be about. The point I'm trying to make is not to be pedantic at all, but just to point out that people often conflate the two. And so lots of descriptions of stories really don't describe the story. You know, we spend virtually zero time in the Shire, for example. So to describe the premise or anything really relevant at all to the story of The Lord of the Rings as being the Shire doesn't actually tell you anything about the story or do anything at all, really. But people have a tendency to focus on this. I understand. You're not a professional media critic. I get it. Could I recommend that it's important to try to figure out what keeps you watching? And that's helpful because if someone is skeptical of, I'm just watching because I like the characters, well, they'll detect that if you tell them that. And then if that doesn't sound cool to them, whatever. If it is cool, maybe you will say some interesting things about the character writing, and then somebody minded toward that will go, ooh, all right, that's interesting. The character is like this. Okay. And then go from there. Anyway, I think premise sucks. Writers, just as an aside, if you like writing premise-based stories, I like them too. I enjoy premises. They're not like boring or inherently bad. They're needed and useful. The beginning of a story. Might I suggest the shorter forms of literature that exist or media? You can make a short story, a novelette, as they're sometimes called, flash fiction. Yes, it can be harder to get these stories out there in one way. Publishers don't want to publish your short story collection at first. They want to publish your novel and then your short story collection. But there are other advantages too. The buy-in from the average audience is shorter. Your piece of media isn't that long, and people have this, in my opinion, misguided, but it's widespread. This is like a three-way battle between the public, me, and all of you. That's what it is, so go figure. People think that they want really short pieces of media. That doesn't really make sense according to me, but that's what people say they want. So you will get a lot of nuts and bolts humans on the ground, word of mouth enjoying your work. And that is a very valid way that many successful pieces of media have, if this is what you care about, marketed themselves. You know, maybe marketing isn't how you make a good piece of art. Maybe premise is very tied up in marketing. But that doesn't mean that they like have to be bad. And they're often really cool. Like, I don't know, I like the premise of Invincible. This is not a show I've seen, but it was a show I was interested in because the premise sounds cool, but then had realized, well, but if it goes on for a while, that isn't enough. And so until I know more, I'm not going to watch it because it's basically guaranteed to wear out unless I hear some evidence to the contrary. And I think that's a very effective heuristic. Again, if you like writing these kinds of stories, creatives, write them. They're cool. They're good. They're cool. You can just make them shorter. There are ways to make them shorter. And, you know, once you've published your novelette or whatever, shorter novels are actually having a moment. If that's what you care about, you probably will be able to get in there. You'd be surprised how much the popular novels in the world at the moment vary in length. A lot of them are pretty short. You can absolutely get the story to basically not wear out its premise before it just ends. And then rather than making sequels, don't do that because your premise is worn out. instead make them in a shared universe, also having a moment. Or you can probably now convince the publisher to do a short story collection if you wanted to do that. Become a specialist at this. It'll be fun. It'll be cool. It'll be less stressful because you won't need to write these huge projects. Why are there not a ton of these in the world already? I mean, and it is a kind of a trend already, so I guess there are some. I don't know. I kind of don't totally get why the premise thing is such a problem. I feel like this is sort of a solved issue. And you can make a story with a good premise if the premise is something that affects the story in an ongoing way or like builds onto itself somehow. So I don't know. I think that is cool and kind of interesting. And I will give you one example that I think is neat. There's a book called Gideon the Ninth, which I think I've talked about in the stream now and again. You might remember it as the lesbian necromancer book. The premise of Gideon the Ninth, the way I'm going to tell you the premise, is it's a deep sci-fi story. It's an advanced sci-fi story about necromancers. Now, necromancers in deep space. Do you see it? Well, if you're in a spaceship, there's not like the ground full of dead stuff. The author has the inspired idea that necromancy is actually kind of shitty in space because you often don't have like materials. And by the way, this means that like hemomancers, like blood users or bone manipulators, osteomancers, are a little bit more valuable than they would normally be. Why not just raise a bunch of minions and swarm people? Well, yeah, that's good, but you can only do it when you're planet side. If you're in a ship or something, not so much. And there's a type of energy, death energy, called Thanergy, Thanatos energy. Anyway, okay, Thanergy, which is like death energy, sort of a negative, nega energy, that comes from things having died in a place. So, for example, if you kill a bunch of stuff on a planet, necromancers can kind of farm it from killing planets, which is pretty messed up, and the story does get into that a little. But this is a whole thing. Yes, that's the premise, necromancers in space, but there is something about that premise that reliably leads to good storytelling unless the author drops the ball. And if the author knows that, here's my heuristic again, you would see it within the first few chapters, and you do, in my opinion, see it within the opening of the book. The details of how necromancy is like kind of a pain in the ass in this world, but that's sort of cool and creates drama. There's an interesting rule of a suggested rule of writing power systems that limitations breed creativity. And this is an example of that too. It's really interesting the ways that characters use this like kind of crippled version of necromancy, but it's still necromancy, which is extremely powerful, obviously. So anyway, that's really cool. And part of the other premise of the setting is that necromancers of each of the necromantic houses traditionally have a cavalier. This is kind of like a bodyguard slash competitive duo queue buddy that isn't a necromancer. They're a melee fighter, basically. And the purpose of them is partly to kind of back you up when you're in situations where necromancy sucks or you run out of Thanergy or something. This is a well-considered premise that will lead to a lot of drama if the writer plays around it. And if you read the first third of the book and they have not used those premises, I don't think they're going to most of the time. Or like, why doesn't the book use it early on? The first third, too, that's not exactly early on. I feel this is a very effective heuristic. If you just do that, I feel 95% of the time I've gotten very good at just avoiding a lot of works that I don't think are that great, and mostly, almost entirely, only finishing or investing into things that are pretty fantastic, though partly due to all of your assistance. So I apologize if it seems like I'm taking a dump all over all of your ideas. I don't mean to be doing that at all, just that I think they're good examples of how to avoid this. I want people to enjoy good media. Yes, invincible, premise-focused thing, good example. And as you explained just, Rusty, you adequately described how the premise is going to wear out. If the exciting thing about season 1 is this, you can realize in that moment, when the veneer of niceness drops and you know he's going to snap into sudden violence under these motivations, Right now that's holding up the show. Now, personally, I've had a lot of fun at times waiting to see if the show picks that up. Like, are we going to do something else? I'm very tempted to derail this parlay into gets better later. We talked about gets worse later, so how about a little bit of that? Maybe we should do a gets better later crew parlay. Because I think on the surface it's going to be asinine, but really gets better later is, I think that does exist and is interesting. I just think it's much rarer. And usually it is when this happens, when a story is premise focused and the premise does wear off, but the story surprisingly either has a good plan or someone has a very good idea for how to like keep going with that part of the story. In fact, I could even give you a few examples if it was at all related to the topic, which it isn't, so I won't, of stories where the beginning really is just bad, but surprisingly, if you just kind of were to ignore that part or something, there is something pretty interesting and inspired later, almost because the premise like changes, or there's like or the premise is undercut in some way, and the story makes the odd move to say, that was never the premise, or that premise that I, the writer, wrote is dumb and we're not doing that anymore. Okay, that's unhinged. Cool. What are we doing instead? And then if that answer is good, it can be kind of interesting. I do think it's vulnerable to the goalposts problem from before. Does it just feel good because the story was kind of bad and had lowered your expectations? I mean, okay. But I think it would be very interesting to get a movie night together, show a bunch of these where you make them skip the bad part of the premise and just give a very basic 1-minute note card summary, and then see if people think it's good. I actually did do this. I asked my partner, I know this seems like a tedious pain, but could you please try? And she said, oh yeah, this seems fine. What the hell happens in the first 4 episodes? And then we watched it and she went, oh... that's not good. That's not good at all. Why did they put that part in? I don't know. That's odd. You seem to have put 4 episodes from before the show should start into the show. And that's another tactic. We've talked a lot about, end the show sooner, or end the piece of media sooner, end the game sooner. But I think it's also a tactic to start later, potentially. One thing this can do also is just jump you out of a lot of writers, in my experience, because this is where I saw this the most. People who are not that experienced at writing fiction will write a boring, like, first fourth of a story, and then it gets interesting and they get to what they wanted to write about. And you do something. You take their manuscript and you just gently put to the side the first like quarter of the pages and basically delete the whole premise. A lot of less experienced writers will also kind of over-explain. So actually, it is explained. And we just kind of start with the good part. And a lot of the time, that basically just works. And you can imagine stories that start kind of in medias res, as it's often called. You can imagine you could have this like prelude of 50 to 100 pages, but that we really don't need, or that we kind of get later. And that's another tactic, is you just put it later instead. Start with the second fourth of the story and put the first fourth of the story after the second fourth, and then trim it down slightly with whatever has been covered through context. It's surprising how often that works, or how many popular, entertaining stories are that. Basically just, if you imagine the story and flip the first and second quarter, it would look like a more normal plot progression, but it would be more boring. It's amazing how often that works, or like is a phenomenon. Just Rusty says, Wicked for Good, another example. This is the Wicked follow-up movie? I didn't know this existed. Wicked for Good is an entirely different beast. Okay. I finished that movie more than a little cross. Well, the first movie was a pretty decent standalone story set in the Wizard of Oz, the world of the Wizard of Oz. The second feels like bad fan fiction. The ever-present weight of The Wizard of Oz is felt throughout, as characters are bent and warped to fit the plot of the story, rather than carrying on the trajectory set up by the first film. There are a couple great songs, and everyone making the movie is clearly putting in the work. The film looks gorgeous, but the plot is so bad, I think it made me like the first movie less. Goes back to our comment before about, does the bad thing later then kind of taint the thing earlier? And if it has continuity, often it is hard to get that out of your memory. It does kind of hurt your memory of the thing. It makes your memory of the first movie, it makes you like the first movie less. Yeah, I would say that's an accurate way to encapsulate that phenomenon. That's a shame. I had not known of this. Yeah, I think Wicked is a standalone thing that has a good ending, or like a reasonable ending. I don't know. When I say good, I just mean it has a sensible ending. And then I don't really like it that much, but it's fine. It's perfectly functional. It makes sense. It's an ending. I feel it's a decisive ending. And so to do more is sort of inherently like, hmm. And to me, this is they're milking your favorite franchise problem. They're cousin to the much rarer. They're milking your favorite franchise, but the milk is tasty, which unfortunately we don't get to discuss here because, yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff tangled up in this one. One of the phenomenons, of course, is that in many such properties, the franchise is so beloved that a lot of people, I'm gonna have to say naively, but I don't want to be mean, want to work on it because they love The Wizard of Oz or Wicked or something, and don't take the step further critically to say there isn't a reason this isn't going to be bad, because there isn't a reason to make this. They're just making more of this thing instead of moving on to something else. We as fans just want more of this instead of moving on to something else, perhaps. But I mean, I'm not going to blame anyone for thinking it might be good. And a lot of the time when the production value is there, it's easy to think, oh well, that how could it be that bad, you know? But I feel a lot of the time, unfortunately, that's exactly why. It's because it was done for the marketing purpose of making another Wizard of Oz or Wicked movie. The Wicked musical on Broadway, or I don't really know that much about that, but anyway, the Wicked musical has been a phenomenon. There's a huge amount of money in making basically anything that has that name attached to it, because people don't use this way of critically thinking through things they enjoy, I guess. But I would not, I hate this. I feel like I'm being forced, and it's my fault. I apologize. I'm sorry to criticize people wanting it to be good, but I just feel like it is clear from a certain perspective that these things probably won't be that good a lot of the time. I'm as guilty as anyone of walking into them. I'm not trying to say you're all idiots for doing that and I'm not. No, I do the same thing. I'm just saying it because I've been frustrated by myself doing the same thing and have then analyzed the situation. I'm sorry. I feel like I'm being an asshole in this parlay, but I suppose that's the topic. I genuinely mean no ill will to this. I just want people to not be disappointed by their favorite things. And in a way, I really admire this way of analyzing it, just Rusty, where you're saying it as you kind of know why. You just had given it a shot. And I really admire that when you said, you noticed that Invincible had kind of worn out a little bit and then just decided if you wanted to stick with it. What could be more noble? Nothing wrong with that. I admire that way of thinking, and I'm just not doing a good job expressing it. So please excuse me sincerely. I do not mean to come across that way. I just don't know how to word it another way. This is one of those on the spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. It's hard. I'm sure there is a way I could say this without it seeming like, well, but it's clear that like, why does everybody think that is going to be so good? But I don't know it. I'm sorry. That being said, I don't know. The Wizard of Oz is an open enough, and it's like a setting focused piece that I do feel like has a higher chance of stuff being good if it's just kind of in an environment and you make things in that environment and it has certain rules. I don't know. Alice in Wonderland has some bad spin-offs, in my opinion, but which I could kind of a little bit more understand why it would seem like they would be good. Does that make sense as an example? So I could see it here. I don't know. And that being said, again, I think you also get a lot of people who the criticism of this type of property is often not very strong. So you can't just look up reviews of it and stuff. I mean, you can kind of never just look up reviews of anything and stuff to get this idea. But a lot of people will be invested in it because people think the media they like is who they are. It's not, but that's what a lot of people think. And so they will apologize for the film's shortcomings because they feel like it's them. Again, the whole like, if the film is bad, then they feel like they're bad because they like it or they want to like it. You're not. It's great that you wanted to like it. And I hate that I feel like I'm stepping on everyone's flower field when I say this. But that doesn't make the movie good. And I mean, you all understand that just fine. I don't know who I'm so emphatically talking to about that, but you get what I mean. And then, of course, another part of it is that professionally, it's often well made. This, to me, is reminiscent of Game of Thrones finale. A lot of the actors and almost everyone in the staff, as far as I know, it defends the final season, and particularly that overly dark episode where we defeat the people. I won't spoil it, I guess, for people who haven't seen Game of Thrones, but if you've watched the end of Game of Thrones, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. How could you not? How could you ever forget, unfortunately? Almost all of the cast and crew of Game of Thrones that I've heard have, in my opinion, pretty shamefully argued that it actually just is good and everyone else is just wrong. This is complete idiocy. Like, that's absurd. People acted like, oh, in the viewing room that has a different kind of screen than every screen that everyone on Earth has, the lighting was right. That probably isn't true, by the way. Like, they're probably just apologizing for it being, or trying to defend that it didn't come out good or something. And that would be fine. You could just say it didn't, like, we didn't do it the way that we thought would look the best. We're sorry. Our bad. We tried to do the best we could. That's completely fine. The only part that isn't completely fine is that you're trying to gaslight me into thinking that it, like, secretly is good if I only had this impossible to acquire viewing experience. Like, no, your job is to make it look good for everybody else, you idiot. You all own devices that can, it's an extremely stupid thing that a huge number of people in the cast and crew are saying. And why are they saying that? Critically, as my own lighting, I have no choice but to use dynamic color balance lighting on my webcam for a complicated reason we're not going to get into. So humorously, as I raise my hands, the lighting of the scene changes. There are problems, and it's fine to say so. It's not fine to say, no, your screen is flickering. You know what I mean? I would be being a complete jerk if I said that. No, it's not. It's my setup, of course. Of course it's my fault. I'm the one with the camera. Anyway, and the editing software, so is what they had. They absolutely, it is just a mistake, and they're just lying that it wasn't a mistake, and that's kind of shameful. But why are they doing that? Well, because they feel that a huge number of people put in professional work that they want to be part of, and they feel like now it's attached to their career and their reputation, so they feel like they need to double down on it, or it's seen as this mistake or a blotch on their resume. Well, I'm here to say, everyone who is paying attention considers the way you treated it this way a blotch on your resume, and you have now lost all credibility as a human being, if you had any of it before, for trying to act like somehow, no, secretly that was just really good the whole time. It's okay to say, we didn't know what to do at the end because George R.R. Martin hasn't written the end of the story, so we didn't know what to do, and we tried to do this. We're sorry it didn't turn out as well as it could have. We hope you like the parts for what they were. And I did like some of the parts for what they were. That would have been fine. Anyway, putting that aside. So I do also think some of the syndrome with Wicked for Good sounds like it's going to be, if the film is of really nice quality, partly it's going to be, well, hardworking people did a good job. And we can give those things credit for what they were. Like, that's interesting. The idea of that overly dark episode, for example, is cool. I really like the trope of a night battle. And part of the focus of Game of Thrones and media like it is getting a little bit of the brutality of medieval style warfare back. And a night battle against, well, you know, if you've watched the show, is a really cool idea. Like, that's great. That part's cool. We can say that part's good and still say the color grading or light balance of the show is bad. That's fine. It is completely unnecessary to do this. And indeed, you can enjoy for what it is. An interesting criticism that comes to mind is Sherlock, BBC's Sherlock, the one with Benedict Cumberbatch. Is pretty bad in my opinion, but it looks cool sometimes. It looks ridiculous other times, but there are some parts that are okay. And also I think quite consistently it looks interesting. It looks ridiculous sometimes, but often that's an interesting visual idea that if you use in a more appropriate context might be really cool. That's neat. That's just cool. That's neat. It doesn't have to be that the show is good, and that doesn't make that bad. It's just interesting. That doesn't make the people who worked on it bad. And I guess this is a problem with the industry. People feel like they need to say that because the industry is shallow enough that people feel like they are saying the person is bad. If they say, oh, this didn't go well, they did bad work. You worked on that, which was terrible. Therefore, you are terrible. But I just feel like 1 or 2 sentences of nuanced discussion about this should be enough to clear that up. And you don't want to be employed by somebody who doesn't have 1 or 2 sentences of nuanced discussion in them about these subjects. But I don't know the industry. Maybe that really is the reality of the situation. I wanted to gently suggest that maybe it's okay to just like talk about it. I don't know. So go figure. That's a shame. But it is really interesting when it's like the thing is of very good quality, but is just, oh, you know? So go figure. Just Rusty, you had weighed in on a point from Mr. Foot earlier about how Morrowind itself, you had mentioned the Starfield is using the same engine as this very old, longer ago engine that Starfield uses, Morrowind, a much earlier game in Bethesda's library, uses. You said Morrowind itself is also a great example of it gets worse later. I love Morrowind with my whole chest. It's one of my all-time favorites. I'm a sucker for a game which thinks start from the bottom, now we're here isn't enough, and instead goes started from the bottom, now we're in fucking space, and power scales through the roof, not with numbers, but practically playing a different game with so many options. But oof, what I would identify as Act 4, get one of the houses of Morrowind on board, is such a momentum cliff. You go from raiding God's vault and proving you're the chosen one to busy work for some dudes. It's the same shit from Act 1, where you're doing busy work to get in with one of the guilds. I've played dozens of Morrowind run-throughs and never completed it, as the game just stops dead in its tracks in this act. Interesting, after 1 hour and 30 minutes, we've arrived at an example where the game like just becomes normally mediocre in a way after a lot of the game goes by. Very interesting. So yeah, this is like a pre-psychology one maybe, where it wasn't tracked that the player might find that to be a nothing burger or like underwhelming or something later on. Obviously, this is a thing that can require a lot of context. Mr. Foot, you chimed in and said, until you learn that Telvanni law is based and you inherit someone's position by killing them. If I recall, you can skip 80% of the act. And that is not an argument, in my opinion, that the game is then good, unless the game directs you to do that. And even then, it would be a very gray area. Is Just Rusty missing some over a threshold of being obvious way out of this situation? Or is it under a threshold of being non-obvious, and therefore it doesn't overall make sense to be part of the game itself, and instead should be attributed to the player? You had a valid, good experience that other people could have with additional instructions, but that doesn't mean it's a fair critique of the game, or depending on where you place that gray line, maybe it is part of the core experience, and Just Rusty unfortunately had a worse experience than they could have. But I don't want to play the blame game any more than I swear, accidentally have. I do not bear you all ill will for anything said in this parlay. I think these responses are awesome. I feel so bad. I think this is just a problem with me. Please tell me if I upset you in any way in this parlay. Yell about it in the comments. We're all here to yell. Go ahead. I don't know. Be nice, I guess, but you don't really have to. I don't know. None of us really were. I think you all did a great job. But yeah, I do think this is an example of that gray area and media criticism happening again. I don't think it is a reasonable response to say there is a valid approach in the game that lets you skip this thing, but who knows if you would know about that? You know what I mean? Kind of like how people will say, well, if you mod this game to add this or that, therefore the game is good. There is a good game that is this game plus that mod, but that is not the same as critiquing this game by itself. It's not fair to say everybody plays it with this mod active. No, statistically, probably at most 50% of people play with that mod active. And that's a really high number, in my opinion. I think in most industry metrics I've seen anyway, it's like 20% of the most. Even if you feel like everyone you know, everyone you've ever heard of, everyone you can find online plays with this mod installed, that's like at most 20% of the people that play the game. And that's just how bubbles and social circles in the world work. And this is an extremely critical aspect of media criticism, in my opinion, that no, not everybody plays with that. I think most of you probably know that, but that is a huge issue in these subjects, that people feel like, well, but why can't I just oversimplify it? I mean, you can oversimplify it as much as you want, but the purpose of discussion is to not oversimplify things. So I go figure. It's not an effective heuristic. So yeah, that is an interesting example of that coming up again as a topic. You could also argue this is interpretable as the knowledge check discussion point. This idea that the thing you like requires certain information, but it's reasonable for the player to know that information. And I think this one is a little more difficult. A lot of the time for me, the hardest way to critique things like this is in a competitive game. This is an odd little one. I'm just adding this in. Nobody mentioned anything about this. But one of the ones I didn't think anybody would bring up, but it was kind of distant, but I think interestingly related, is how we critique competitive games. So It Gets Worse Later has, yes, I'm going to do it. It happens in almost every parlay. This is me. This is my life. I'm sorry. A build system problem. Maybe, obviously. There's a lot of build systems, a lot of popular games with build systems in them that the build system doesn't actually have meaningful diversity or like actually engaging decisions or whatever. But unless you play the game more than a certain amount, that doesn't happen or occur to you. Or maybe it doesn't even lack that diversity of decisions until later, like you unlock something later that trivializes options. To go a little further, in competitive games, often you literally just need to get above a certain rank. You literally need to be better than a certain amount at the game for the game's metagame to narrow to a certain point. And then you might argue it narrows to the point that it's not that fun. There's many anecdotes from my personal life. The most memorable and probably historically the most famous one that I experienced was Jace the Mind Sculptor and Cawblade. In some of the time I played Magic when I was in high school, there was a deck in Magic the Gathering's history where the top 8 for the World Championships was 7 out of 8 this deck, like within 4 cards or so, the same deck. And the thing is, it's a pretty interesting deck to play in my and a lot of those pro players' opinion. I never played with the deck, but I played against it a ton. Everybody did at that time. Any rich, spoiled bougie kid that you met at the game store had this deck and played with his headphones in, which is super discourteous, by the way. Just talk to a human. I had a hilarious game against some kid where we played game 1 and I won, and he's playing a deck that is $600 and was 7 of the 8 decks of the World Championship, and I was playing a thing I made up. That doesn't make it bad, but this kind of person thinks that means there's no way that would beat my real deck or whatever, And he had his headphones in, and I won the match, and he said nothing. He didn't speak the entire time we interacted, and he just took out one headphone and put it on the table. And then we played game 2, he won, and then I played game 3 and he lost. He took out the other headphone and left the entire store. And that was it. And the shopkeeper, who I was acquainted with, just looked over at me like, and I went, "Oh yeah, no, it's fine." I smiled and I walked over, and he said, did he leave?" And I said, "I don't know, maybe he's going to the bathroom. I won 2-1. And he went, "Oh yeah, okay, sure, cool. What was he playing?" And I was like, "Oh, it was JTMS." And the shopkeeper went, "Okay, what were you playing?" And we chatted about it a little, and it was a good time. It was not a bad experience. I took it in stride and it was funny, but it was pretty overwhelming. And it was the kind of thing that if you didn't play above a local level, you might encounter that deck, but I mean, would it be that bad? I also, similarly, around that time, played this Infect aggro deck. Infect was this unique mechanic that ignored your life total and let you do damage to a special different life total that is their, tolerance to poison, the Phyrexian oil, if you know Magic lore. And so you only need to do 10 damage to them if it's Infect damage instead of 20. All of the buff cards that, can buff these cards convert their 2/2 buff to the creature into 4/4, because now you only have to do 10 damage instead of 20, and these decks could, with their better draws, kill the opponent on turn 2. If they don't have a turn 1 play and you're on the play, potentially you could kill them before they played, which is obviously terrible and toxic. However, if you play the game at a competitive level, does this deck actually have the win rate to be present at that competitive level? Maybe it doesn't. I don't think it does. It wasn't super popular in my memory. It existed. But if it did, you see where I'm going with this. You would create a situation where only if you play the game above a certain skill level, not even necessarily if you keep playing it forever, but only if you play it for a long time and get above a certain skill level, does it then become like quantum bad. It sort of changes and is now bad. Or you could say the counterplay necessary for a sufficiently skilled player is bad, but you have to get to a very high level of play for that to be an issue. Chess openings might be something that a lot of chess players really don't like. and find exhausting and terrible. And this is a major problem with modern chess. Studying openings with the modern tools has just taken over the game from some players' perspective, quite famously Magnus Carlsen's perspective. But that isn't really a thing at all to a lot of people who play chess. They know of the openings, but it just isn't a major issue for them playing the game. And I'm sure it's not actually that high of a level, but like, below a certain level of play, you can totally have fun with chess, and that's just not part of the game. So the knowledge checks go both ways, where yes, there are some of them where it's like, do we add that as part of the core experience of the game? Like Mr. Foot bringing up the Telvanni Law skip, where you assassinate the person to take over there to get one of the Houses of Morrowind on board. Or like you mod a game and that mod is like reasonable and relatively common, but it's only relatively common, and so you have to decide where to draw the line. But there's also the element where sometimes you need to even be able to play a game above a certain level. You could extend this critique even to games like Elden Ring, where the game is just hard enough that I think a lot of people will get enjoyment out of it, but simply not get past the point of the game where a lot of people feel the difficulty accelerates to the point that the balance falls apart. And to finish up the parlay, we'll talk about that a little bit more. This has gotten very long, and we need to do the meta parlay thing. So Ragnavar, forgive me, I am going to summarize a little, but I think that this topic you brought up is really cool, and if you're interested, would be a really good normal parlay topic that if you feel I've cut too short, I am happy to give you as a free on-the-house parlay from me as well. We can talk about it more, but I feel for the sake of time and partly due to my own, we'll talk about it in a few minutes, it's just too long to include all of this, but I will talk about the subject because it's really smart. Basically, you're bringing up this idea that if you try to save a long-running thing by doing more of the same, this often backfires as well in some creative ways. Ragnavar says, my more interesting thoughts on this topic I've been thinking about is the stuff that doesn't get truly awful later or over time, or starts bad and somehow escalates into kind of a weaponized badness, or even something that's so bad it swings back around to being good. But instead it's just experience that starts great, and they don't get worse in what they're actually doing, but they just get absolutely exhausting to continue with. This I have brought up at the very beginning. If you play something for long enough, it just is inevitably going to be bad. I guess to answer my own question at the beginning of the parlay. Obviously, Ragnavar continues, live service games are some of the most prone to this. No matter how much the game changes, if it's going to avoid losing its existing player base by becoming what's practically a meaningfully different game altogether, the developers will be leaning more toward an iterative approach to making more game in the game, and that's going to burn people out if they don't take breaks from the game in question or just end up leaving altogether. There's only so much of one game you can keep playing over and over and over again without needing to put it down, do something else for a while, and maybe possibly come back later once you feel up to playing whatever new stuff's been added. This is a big part of why FOMO, fear of missing out mechanics, and events are so toxic. If you get invested enough in that one game, and you need to grind for hours just to make sure you get that limited item or character, you end up playing for longer in each session, across more of your free time, doing something that likely is repetitive enough that you've long stopped having fun, which massively increases the likelihood you're going to burn out sooner. And I just wanted to quickly add that because you feel like you're missing a limited time game piece, this then breaks the idea that you can take a break and come back later, because if you take a break and come back later, well, you will have maybe permanently missed that thing. So you feel like even to take a break, you need to not take a break to an extent. It's bad. It's a broken model of doing game design. That this kind of gameplay is largely added to increase player retention, one asks the question how effective it actually is. Many developers are unlikely to share the raw data, and even if they did, we can't compare with the alternative scenario without changing world lines, which I for one cannot do. Even if we had the results of a study, it's not going to have the participants to be truly conclusive. Yeah, it's not really possible to know if this is effective. We can only speculate. I think the problem is just that most developers believe they do know that it does for a fact retain players, but we do not know that. Nobody can really ever know that, I would argue. You could try to contrive an extremely complicated situation where you could maybe draw a conclusion, but I think that rather than doing empirical science here, we need to do psychology and some prediction. And I think it's pretty clear when you look at it on paper that this is not an effective player retention tactic. And a lot of games in the modern era have been part of a really interesting trend toward actually basically doing the same thing, but just making it so the thing you would feel FOMO about can be completed very, very fast, which is interesting. That does kind of work a little bit. It makes you feel tempted to just keep up with the game to get all the stuff. Definitely talking from personal experience. I've had an interesting process over the past few years, mostly for work, but it's been fun. I have dropped more games in the past 2 years than I have in my entire life so far, actually by a lot, especially games that I've spent a lot of time on, especially games that I like and have spent a lot of time on, mostly because they don't go over my current threshold for how much time it takes to maintain them or like to keep up with their build system. And it just so happens, I think by total coincidence, that the time in my life when I needed to do that happens to be a flashpoint in the industry where the industry is grappling with like, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? Maybe we should make it like possible for a human with a schedule and not a ridiculous amount of free time to keep up with our games. Maybe we should do that. And that is what's been happening. And it's been very interesting to see the many ways the games have done this. Though a lot of the time, if a game started out not adapting to this model, noticed this trend, and then tried to put in a way to skip things, we actually had a conversation on the stream related to this. You often get games where, yes, you can keep up with it, but by the game allowing you to skip through that so much, it now feels kind of brought into sharp relief. Like, isn't it sort of pointless now? Why do you even need to do this if it lets you just blaze through it so quickly? Or, auto complete it. So, yeah, it's really interesting as a significant problem in this discussion that even if you were to do everything right, we've said in this parlay, you are doomed to have the thing feel bad no matter what if it goes on past the certain point. Even if you deliberately try to counter those exact things, not only if you like don't make all the mistakes, it's just sort of fundamentally bad for anything to be longer than a certain amount. Just as I was saying at the beginning of the parlay, I'm going to argue that it does have to be pretty long for that to be an issue. A long novel is not long enough for this to be a problem, in my humble opinion. It might be for some people. I would argue it moderately objectively is not an issue. If you read one chapter of the longest popular books that exist every night, you will finish them way sooner than you would finish any of this stuff. So as objectively as we can say, I personally do not think that those works have that problem. And this is not an argument for this show or book is a little long, therefore that's bad. No, that's good, according to my argument at the beginning anyway. But there are long enough works that it is bad, I would say. Ragnavar continues, still to me, this experience is one I've had pretty often in all sorts of media, not just within live services. There's many cases where people complain that the last act of a game takes too long to complete, Baldur's Gate 3, and despite still being the same game, with the same moment-to-moment gameplay that those players were enjoying earlier on, just the act of putting too much of the same ruined the experience for them, or at least put a dampener on their experience later on. And a good example here is kind of Elden Ring. These are games that have a sort of barrier past which you said even outside of live service, this kind of sensation of the gameplay having run its course can be found. Many players of Elden Ring have said that the latter half, and especially the final areas of the game, feel like a slog, as boss aggression and damage have escalated beyond what quite a number are comfortable with, and the sheer number of them throughout the game can make players feel like the game's already shown them and allowed them to experience what the systems have to offer. They're ready to finish the game and move on to another game, but there's still more. I do want to have some sympathy here for what I said before about, why don't people see this coming or whatever, or why are people so obsessed with endings? Well, it's fair to want an ending, to psychologically desire there to be a conclusion to the game, and so if the game holds that hostage by making a ton more of it, yeah, What I really don't understand, and Elden Ring is a really good example for this, is why those games don't simply put a little bit more of that content in the post-game, which is enormous, extensive, and popular in many of these games. Elden Ring and many games like this have tons of content after, the credits roll and the story, such as it is concluded. So why do they feel the need to make you do such a majority of that stuff just to get this feeling of closure? That's kind of odd to me. Yes, I would go even further. Elden Ring is an example of a game where if you keep scaling the power, the damage, the HP of bosses, the game design does kind of break or at least change. You might have liked that part. I think that it's pretty bad. I actually liked it a lot. But it's not good design because the game is built around you being able to dance with the enemy a little. Up until past, like, maybe the first time you go to the Erd tree, it is very possible and coherent to take a hit or two from an enemy, have the risk of healing or like having to avoid an enemy, which is one of the core appeals of the FromSoft games. You take damage, you will now die in one or two more hits. You want to drink a flask to heal, but the enemies are programmed to look for that. It's programmed to take just long enough that you won't get it off, and then they'll hit you. So you live in a moment of tension where you're trying to avoid their attacks. That's the point of the game. That's fun. That's what people who like these games like significantly. We'll get to that in a minute. After you get a certain part into the game, that just ceases to be true for most builds. The enemies scale their damage, yes, just a little more. But they pass a threshold where now you will no longer survive 2 or 3 hits. You'll survive like 1 hit or a combo that will kill you in 1 hit with hit stop and etc. And this fundamentally violates the principle that the entire game is built around. I'm not saying that I found it too hard, though I thought it was challenging, but I actually enjoyed it a lot, and only noticed when I was nearly done that for a while now, I've been needing to go pretty hard on getting my build in a certain place just to make the game like I was adapting and having fun adapting, but then turned around and noticed, well, wait a minute though, I only need to adapt in this way because the game has stopped working the way it normally did. And a lot of players on the internet say, oh no, it's just impossible to survive. Well, no, it's not. If your career is to think about builds all day, of course it isn't. I can figure out something of every single playstyle possible in the entire game that will make me survive. But that's me saying that. Like that doesn't mean anything. The enemies just straight up are not the game design idea once you get past a certain point. They're just they're not about the same type of challenge. Now again, there's a whole category of people taking that pin out that like Elden Ring because they want it to be brutally punishing the whole time. I'm just saying I don't think the game points you toward, or that almost everybody has, and FromSoft knows that almost everybody is not having that kind of experience. If you like playing the game because you want to do perfect, you want to beat every boss without taking a single hit, that's really cool. I enjoy watching those videos. That one player who plays with like no armor and just the helmet on and beats bosses for people. I don't remember the name of this player, but if you know anything about Elden Ring, you're probably familiar. That's really cool, and I enjoy that. It's not how I personally play, but I think it's interesting and neat. I don't think it's fair to then say that that means that is the real version of the game. I'm only arguing that this version of the game is instead more the core design because I feel more of the game systems support it. I feel that when the game gives you things, it's giving you things that let you survive a hit or two. It's giving you enemies that are programmed to punish you trying to flask, rather than all the systems being built around you getting one-shotted. For example, why all the healing stuff if the game is core about, the real game is about you always getting one-shotted? It's not, would be my answer. It's perfectly okay. It's really cool to enjoy that. But this is a case where, well, it's good that you enjoy that. But the game is not significantly designed around that experience. And so I do think for many people, it understandably falls apart. Not only, as Ragnavar is pointing out, does merely repeating the same thing over and over again maybe just get tiresome for some people. Although I think for a lot of people, if they had more ability to vary their build, they might enjoy Elden Ring for longer, but the upgrade system can be pretty punishing. Anyway, just doing it a lot and with similar builds might have gotten old. But even further, the game design itself just is only designed within a certain band. If you make enemies do more than a certain amount of damage, and the player's ability to get defensive stats and HP tapers off, you get less for each stat point you put into a stat in Elden Ring. There's a couple of thresholds. It's a little complicated mathematically, but mostly you just need to know if you put a point into HP, the next point you put into HP doesn't give you as many points of HP. That's the part that matters here, which means you cannot just keep up with the scaling forever. It's not the player's fault that like doesn't work anymore. The game is designed for that to eventually hit a wall, which is good for the rest of the game. It prevents the player from being able to be extremely tanky because the game is about them getting killed in 2 to 3 hits. You can try to make an extreme build where you don't, and those are interesting. I've tried them before. That was how I dealt with some of this bullshit. But the focus of the game is on that, around that level of dance. And we've had interesting conversations before about, you could extrapolate to say, is any game good if you get literally one-shotted for most players? Some people might find a way to enjoy that. That's good for them. But almost all game systems objectively don't do anything if you just get one-shotted. And so I think that you tanking a hit or two and then living in that tension is kind of the thing for most games. Another example where this is an issue would be Hollow Knight, in my opinion. And Hollow Knight Silksong, but it's been brought up. The Silksong community is they already know that. We don't need to. And I haven't gotten to play more of Silksong yet. So anyway, it's a thing in a lot of other games. Yes, this is a great point. Ragdavar, you were just saying there's so many small dungeons and mines for the player to clear for an item they may or may not actually want, with no way to know what the item is beforehand within the game to thus evaluate if it's worth clearing. You can look it up, but again, people overestimate how much anyway. It's not part of the core game. It's a thing you can do. It's great that you do it. I did it too. That's good, but it's not part of the core experience. And while many will either look up where the items, they want are, I thought you said that later, or only play what they want regardless of missing an item they like in their build, many others will clear all of them just to have all of the items in order to avoid missing the final piece of their build that makes it even stronger, or even come together to begin with in some cases. Sure, there's lots of problems with Elden Ring where they don't make it clear that there will be an item that supports this playstyle, and the only item that supports it is hidden in a cave somewhere. And it can be a feeling where if you know that it's in that cave, you now have to play for long enough that you get tired of playing before you get the item. That is, it gets worse later simply because it takes too long to get a playstyle enabling item. A lot of those things are not that early in the game, which I find odd. They're not good until you have other stuff to enable them, so why doesn't the game just put them earlier on? It doesn't feel like sorry, I'm sure there was plenty of thought, but enough thought was given to where would it be good in the game relative to the rest of the game for this item to be based on what kind of experience the player will have making a build with this item. As I've talked about a lot in Parley before, it seems to me the industry just isn't really thinking about that yet, and that's okay, but that is a problem here. It means that you often have to play deeper into the game than you might like to. That will wear out its welcome. You're discovering, but you're done discovering, and now you want to try this strategy and play the game and crunch through a bunch of bosses. But the game has decided to put something that enables a major playstyle, a lot of major playstyles, too late in the game's progression. So yeah, I think I'm sorry to cut this part short. Ragdavar, you wrote about 3 times that much about this topic, and it's good stuff to discuss. But I think it is too much to fit into the Parley as is. So I'm sorry if you feel like I missed stuff. It's a little bit my fault. We'll talk about that now a little. So I wanted to apologize by saying I am happy to do it as a free Parley if you want to. Let me know, message me, or we can talk on a stream. So let's talk about that. But folks, if you enjoyed this, I'll conclude as normal now. I usually say, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it and had fun. I hope I didn't hurt anyone physically. You don't have to listen to my words. They can't hurt you. But I don't mean any malice or aggression to anybody. I genuinely want everybody to be happy. But I do have a lot of frustration, mostly toward, I don't know, I guess the frustration to me is that a lot of people say at once, why does everybody have to complicate everything so much? But then I can't believe this movie I wanted to like is bad. Because you told me I'm not allowed to say the reason why you could know it was bad to begin with. And none of you were saying this. So I hope I clarified that well enough. I feel bad for making you feel like you did something wrong for walking into that bad experience. I just want people to enjoy their entertainment. But I do think a lot of the general public, and many frustrating experiences for me in the past, sorry, I can't keep those out of this, have been people saying that it isn't valid to have that line of reasoning, but then when they walk directly into these issues, when I easily avoided them, they say that there's just no solution. Why is the world so bad like this? Well, it's because you insist on not trying to do something about it. And a lot of you are the people who are trying to do something about it. So I just wanted to say I really appreciate that. Thank you. And I really admire a lot of your, rage, sure. But I thought quite interesting perspectives on this. And again, as is often the magical case with Crew Parlay, people have their own slants on these, and almost everybody brought up a entirely distinct form of gets bad later. So if you'd like to be part of these Crew Parlay, one of the reasons I do Crew Parlay is that I don't want to ask people to support the channel and my work for the full price of Parlay just to get to do Parlay. It's meant to be a service where you can kind of chew on some thoughts that, you know, we have blessedly little time to in our day-to-day life. A lot of problems we discuss on Parlay come back to people don't really get time to just consider things carefully and are smart and would be able to figure it out if they did. And part of the point of Parlay is meant to be, I just think it's really fun, and obviously I like to do that, but to allow there to be a service where for a, I hope, modest price, people can have a little podcast about something they want to think about more, and I can chat about it a bit. So rather than it being full price Parlay only, Crew Parlay is where for a lower amount of money, people can all contribute to one and we can talk about it together. So that's what I try to do. This is at the $5 tier, which I treat as Twitch Prime as well. So if you have Amazon Prime or Twitch Prime, the largest number of people who support me financially are at that tier. So you already have this for free. If you connect your Discord account, you just get access to this and you can do it every month. And we would love to have you. I promise I'm not going to yell at your children or something if you don't want me to, question mark. So yeah, we'd love to have you. And the link in the description if you're interested. And I know some of you just support the show that way, so thank you very much. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the meta parlay stuff now, a little like post-game thing. It's nothing serious, really. I'm mostly just going to explain my own flaws with the subject, and we'll unpack it a little. Basically, the idea is that obviously in the long run, or the medium term, Crew Parlay was gonna get long enough once there were enough people in the system that we were gonna need to figure out what to do with that length. We could just make them really, really, really long, which we did. That's completely fine. This one is 2 hours, almost on the dot right now. And that is about the length of my streams and our streams when we talk on Thursday and Friday. The tea time streams are this webcam format. I drink some beverage, often tea, but all sorts of beverages, cocktails, mocktails, coffee, whatever. And we basically talk about this. So I on that level, I don't think it's bad to have Crew Parlay be about this length, to be a little longer if they come out once a month or so. It's a longer offering. This is part of a strategy I like to use on YouTube on all of my channels that I call a shotgun strategy. Having a little variety of lengths of video. It needs to be lengths that are suitable to the type of content, but for a lot of topics, there are several lengths that would be good, and I think you can do satisfying parlay in 10 minutes, in 40 minutes, and in 2 hours. And so I don't think it's bad to have that range of lengths. That is a feature, not a bug, to me. So that's one thing. I don't think that's bad. On the other hand, I mean, this actually was only 4 or 5 people giving longer responses. Sure, certainly long responses. Many of these responses were longer than normal parlay responses, longer than the people who request normal parlay. All of these people have normal parlay currently. Longer than those people's normal parlay. So on some level, you could say, well, Zandy, you need to enforce a character limit or like a response limit. I don't want to do that. I want to talk about why I don't want to do that, but maybe we do need to do that. Here's another idea, though. Maybe it ought to just be a stream, / it almost already is a stream, you know? It would kind of be better if you all could respond as I responded to your responses. Anyway. But then I'm kind of making a stream where you would need to pay to talk, or you wouldn't need to pay to talk, but for the topic to be brought up, and it would be very challenging to pace, you know, when it's not topics coming up in chat. It is difficult to pace that in an even way. Without really needing to expend too much effort other than writing show notes, and this one did have some of the longer show notes of any parlay I've ever done, but it depends on the topic too. Like I just had more to write this time. It can be really easy to pace it out, to be kind of even. I felt like I talked about most of these topics for the amount of time there was stuff to say about them. And I personally feel like this one went pretty well from a structural perspective. But it would be very difficult to do that in the same way on a stream. Another flaw with long crew parlay is that at a certain point it becomes you need to be willing to watch like a 3 or 4 hour video, or I need to do timestamps for every single response, which takes longer than you would think. That will take almost as long as doing these at a medium length, unless I do them as I go, which will interrupt the pacing. I'll have to stop, go and then keep going, or pause. And, you know, it's not maybe that jarring, but there will be like 20 jump cuts in the parlay, which that's fine. I can do that if that's what people would prefer, by the way. I just read the timestamp on the thing. But again, a lot of the time, one of the better parts is the discussion. You can see that I don't think there's a super easy solution that unfortunately doesn't sacrifice some benefit. And that's okay. We could sacrifice some benefit. I'm just trying to think of what else might be worthwhile. What else is a good solution? Or could be a solution. So I don't know. I do think that the word limit thing is reasonable. And I think that people responding multiple times is probably something I should discourage, or not discourage. I think that's cool. But I should probably say, so that everybody has a chance to go, try to limit it to one like message in Discord. It has to fit within one Discord message. But that has its own problems, because part of the point of parlay is that we don't need to shortcut the full explanation. And a lot of these, like, I think for you, you didn't explain your point particularly in a particularly verbose way, necessarily. There might have been some prelude that wasn't needed to get the point across, but it made it flow better. And I'll quickly tell you that if you were to cut off, like, let's say the first 2 paragraphs of Mr. Foot's response, just as a random example I scrolled to, like, yes, it would be a followable prompt, but very quickly when people listen to it audio only, it's going to become hard to follow if I'm jumping around with topics like this. I try to do transitions, but do that more, and it's going to get longer that way too. So it's really difficult. You could say, just like I argued in this parlay, that this is an idea you can foresee getting bad later. Yes, I'm going there. Sorry, what else are you here for, right? This is an idea that you could argue, yes, it's not clear that crew parlay will become bad, but isn't this idea just going to become bad once it goes on long enough? And I mean, I don't know. I personally feel like it's open-ended enough, and there are enough different ways to do it, that it's worth seeing what the culture, I'm going to bring that into the conversation now, what the culture of crew parlay will be like. Part of the reason I'm doing this segment, even though I don't really know what to do, / I don't really feel it's necessary to do anything yet, I'll get back to that in a minute, is because I think it's significantly a culture issue. Not issue, really, but that just me saying these things, and you all are reasonable and will think about them, often will be enough for something to shift. On the streams and on our Discord, I do use moderation in different forms than is common on the internet. We use different forms of moderation, especially a homebrew one on Discord. But a major aspect of the reason why moderation is less necessary in those spaces is the culture aspect. We do not run a community that is just about hanging out on the internet. We run a community with an idea centralized around it, with a concept that it is grouped around, with a focus, with people that actually have some common ground, rather than just thinking they have common ground if they all like this superficial thing. It's the way we like it. There's a famous quote from I don't know who, and it's terrible, so it doesn't matter, that I'll never forget, where the person says, "It's not why you like it. It only matters what you like. It's not why you like it." Nothing could possibly be less true. What an idiotic thing to say. The only thing that matters is why you like the thing. And the circumstances of the specific are only a way to get introduced to people on the most basic possible level. It has no further value than literally any other way you could do anything to get introduced to people, and that's it. Then the value of liking the same thing has expired. That's it. It is the least possible valuable common ground to have. It is valuable only in the way that a penny is valuable. It is more money than 0. And pennies were recently phased out in the United States. So, you know, go figure. And I think that this is a case like that. We have a why vaguely in common here, and only vaguely in common too, which is good. You get a melting pot of different versions of the same thing. You all seemed to understand the prompt just fine, but you had different versions of interpreting it. That's really cool. That's like the whole point. It works, right? So that's the other approach to take, is the benefit of Crew Parley is that we all have common ground of some sort, a common why or understanding, but we get to see different slants on that. And so all you need to do is not necessarily fix the problems such as they are, but simply preserve that effect. And what do you need to do to preserve that effect? I don't know. I'm just saying that could be I don't know. Presumably when I figure it out, it will be by thinking about it that way. I'm not sure. That's what I'll start by thinking about. I wanted to end by explaining why personally I feel like this is an outlier and this isn't actually that urgent of an issue. Like this won't be an issue for a while, really. And so we don't actually need to know that much. Normally I wouldn't bring this up if I didn't have a solution, but how about a Crew Parley about different solution? I mean, that's like the whole point, right? So obviously just telling you all what the problem is isn't going to get it solved slower. So that's something. But the other reason is my circumstances. I know a lot of you know this, but a lot of people who watch Parley regularly don't. I've been tanking for quite a while on my bootleg builds and Zany Pants YouTube channel videos. For a variety of complicated reasons, I will make a video explaining. You deserve to know, and it's interesting, could be valuable to someone else. It's fine, but we don't need to talk about it here. And that is winding down. All of the things in my way have been either dealt with or identified and welcomed into the disgusting masses of my psyche. And so now a lot of logistical and physical problems as well. A lot of it is not a thing about me, but a lot of it is stuff about me. I feel we can get going and have been furiously making videos now that I feel like the floodgates are back open, or I've opened them. It's a combination of both. But that has meant that the audience doing Crew Parley has been pretty static. My business model is sort of a funnel. The Zany Pants YouTube channel is the broadest, about game design focused on build systems. Bootleg Builds is specific builds, bootleg builds, if you like, go figure, and also has things like stream archives or meme versions of build or Zany Pants videos. And then Pantaloon Saloon is even more specific, exact specific topics, not even always from me, that the audience discusses. It is the ultimate. We have gotten a general topic, then we get a little bit more into specifically how you would apply that topic, builds that specifically apply that build system game design thinking, and then we get even more specific to the only thing here in common with Zany Pants is the why of how I'm doing the videos. The what is gone. And that's what is important in the world, so that's why I do it that way. And then the Twitch streams are even more specific. Basically just this, but in a public forum. But the Twitch stream is designed to be the smallest, not the largest. It's the place where we go to chat with the people that are super into the why. And I think that works really well. But obviously the way that that system is meant to work is that the Zany Pants and Bootleg Builds channels need to be powered up to trickle down to make all the rest of this function. That will then hydrate these services, Pantaloon Saloon and the streams, with new people, with new ideas. And that is an intended part of this system. Until that happens, probably once everything is rehydrated in that metaphor, sometime by the end of the year, there will be what you can expect to be the ecosystem going forward for Parley and Crew Parley, which is probably around the time we will need to have a working solution to this. So we have about half a year. That's not bad, I would venture. And in the first place, the reason that this one was so long is partly because I invited people to respond after it had gone up, because I was behind with my work. Again, these things are my fault and likely won't apply in the future, but also there will be more people in these in the future. So it's worth touching on now. In many ways, I was actually quite excited to see a lot of responses, knowing it was going to be way too many in some regard, because it means we can touch on this issue now and then have a solution ready for later. I can kind of test. This wasn't as much over as I thought, but it was also a little more over than I remember at the beginning. I said, maybe it won't be that bad. It's not that bad. I mean, it's not that long, but like this is still pretty long. So if even this, with only this number of people, is getting long, we definitely need to think about the subject. So yeah, it's my fault, and I don't want you to feel bad. You all did great by responding in interesting and complex ways. I would hate for anyone to assume that because I'm talking about this, therefore it's people getting scolded for giving longer responses. Obviously not bad. It's my job to figure out what is a good way to do it, and you helped. So thank you for doing that again, I'll say. But yeah, I think it's sort of okay for now, just something worth chewing on going into the future ones of these. But again, because I was behind a little bit and invited people to come back and respond, that is part of why this one ballooned as well. It was pretty anecdotal. I do want to say that I think people responding shortly, like briefly to each other's prompts is probably better to be done in a discussion channel. And we do have one for the Parley or like Patreon specific channels. You don't need to do it there, of course, but I made a channel like that nobody ever uses, which is fine. It was intended for this kind of thing, so you can still talk about this stuff without it necessarily being like in the Parley. You don't have to do that. I need to figure out what the policy will be, but I did want to gently poke that perhaps that is going to end up being the solution a little. Because it's fun for people to be able to respond, but anyway. So yeah, I don't know. I guess what I'm floating around is probably a word limit is the only thing that's feasible, and I just need to make it long enough that it is reasonable to get the topic across that you want to describe within that word limit. And I don't really feel like we need that much of a word limit for Parley. You know, the people who do really long Parley have understood, and I'm thankful that you all understand, that's worked pretty well, that if you make a Parley that's ridiculously long, that's okay, but I might struggle to even read all of it within 45 or 50 minutes. And in that case, that will be all I will get to do, or you could specify that you want me to cut off and just respond. That's okay, but I feel that one will self-correct, whereas this one is kind of capable of being infinite. So I also don't think this is really a problem for Parley in the same way. It's kind of a crew Parley specific thing in my mind. What are your thoughts? If you have them, let me know. Fortunately, a lot of the people responding to this are the core audience. So you folks, I'm sure, can talk to me on the stream. The kind of deep core audience, maybe I should say. The night core audience, if you will. But those of you listening too, what do you want to hear from these? That obviously still matters. You don't need to be paying to weigh in at all. I hope that goes without saying. So let me know if you have a different take on the subject. Anyway, I think that's it. So I'll see you in the next one, which will be a little bit sooner than a month because we are still behind by one, but I'm almost caught up now. We should be caught up by the end of the month, almost exactly the end of the month. Looking forward to it.